well. So one of the main things that come up one of the signs is that they listen to respond. And I think that one of the biggest complaints in relationships is that the partner feels like their partner doesn't, one person feels like the partner's not listening to them. And so when we listen, we don't really listen to hear, we listen to respond. So we're waiting for that person to stop talking, and then we can respond about something. We can respond to, most often defensively about what, no, that's true, no, that's not true, that is true, whatever we're going to say, instead of coming from a place of really seeking to listen to that person and what they're saying. Oftentimes the person doesn't pay attention. They might ask questions that are already discussed. So you know that they're not listening if they're, say, multitasking, they're on their phone, they're watching TV, and they're kind of half listening. Or maybe you say something to them and then they wait, and then they ask you a question to something about what you just said, which indicates that they're not really listening to you. They often, another sign would be they interrupt a lot. And so when you're trying to talk about something and express how you feel, then they might be more inclined to interrupt you with, no, that's not true, or I don't know what you mean, and not really providing you the space in which to share what you're feeling. Another sign is that they might do some stonewalling. And stonewalling is giving you the silent treatment. So instead of saying something like, "Hey, this isn't a good time to talk right now," or I'm feeling overwhelmed, what they're going to do is they're going to stonewall. They'll give you the silent treatment, which I think is probably one of the main relationship killers, is to stonewall, give your partner the silent treatment. I don't really I mean, I don't really know, what really is one of the things that's even worse than that. I think that's one of the worst things you can do, is totally ignore your partner and give them the silent treatment. If you wanna say to them, "Hey, I need some time to think about this, and let me come back to you in a period of time," that would be something that would be a healthy communication tactic. But that's not what people do. They'll stonewall, they'll become defensive, and they'll ignore you, which leaves the other person feeling often like they're walking in eggshells. They're not really sure what to do, and they're left with kind of circling all these different thoughts of what might be going on in their partner's mind, instead of that partner coming to you or whoever, saying how they feel about something. um, like I said, they might, like I said, multitask. They might become, another sign is they become very self-absorbed. They think about themselves. They Again, stonewalling is avoidance. And they might, another sign they're a bad communicator is that they might have poor EQ, which is poor emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is being able to become aware of how you're feeling and what you're thinking, and being able to express those feelings and thoughts in a productive and a healthy way, and also being able to be self-aware of when you're getting charged up and how emotionally you're feeling about something, and be able to manage that, and not being explosive, and not being what I refer to as a powder keg. Powder keg is, right, someone who just kind of explodes, and they really can't manage their emotions. And those are some of the more prominent signs of someone who's a bad communicator. Um, Another question was posed to me was, what does that look like? And I think that one of the main things that comes up for me in therapy when I'm working with people, what does that look like, is uh, poor, maybe not poor, but negative communication patterns that have been established within that partnership. For example, a very common one is, say, the distancer pursuer relationship, where one person is going to distance, and the more that person distances themselves, the more that person pursues. And then they set up like this negative cycle of how they're going to relate to one another. Another negative pattern is that they have a really hard time managing conflict, and that they're going to use some tactic as a way to communicate whatever their need is, even though that pattern is no longer working. So you could have someone who's maybe passive aggressive, who's aggressive in their tone, who uses sharp words, who gets in there and says something to the partner, and then the partner's going to react react or respond in a certain way. And then over time, what's going to happen is that that couple is going to create their own dance, and they're going to create that pattern, which really becomes ineffective. And so what brings people into therapy a lot is that they use this word of, we just feel stuck. So they're stuck because they keep doing the same thing over and over again, and they really don't know what else to do. And so they find, like, we just keep coming back to these circular conversations of the same thing over and over, and we're not really resolving anything. One person gets in and says, their part in the play, and the other person gets in and says their part in the play, and then just kind of go back and forth. And then it ends. however, and then maybe a couple days go back and things are okay, and then they return to that same pattern. So if I would say, what does it look like? Well, that is one of the main themes as the negative pattern of communication that has been set up between two people. Another thing it might look like is, name calling, or sometimes there's like a lot of verbal aggression. Once again, what does it look like that each person or one person doesn't feel safe expressing how they feel about something. And so they're going to come in maybe feeling tenuous or trepid about bringing something up. And lots of times people, they'll just say and do things that are really destructive towards that communication pattern and towards that person. And so that's another way in which this, what that poor communication looks like. And I think if I go back to the emotional dysregulation, I think that this is also a pattern. It's like both people or one can't manage their emotions. They get explosive. They say something. They shut down. They stonewall. And then what happens is this pattern becomes like the same complaints over and over again. But I will say that although I can identify the patterns and people can identify the patterns, my experience has taught me that although people argue about a lot of things, what they're really arguing about, like they can say they're arguing about, dishwasher and kids and work and whatever. And I'm not saying that those issues are not true, but I think by and large, the poor communication is a breakdown in that one person or both people feel disconnected from each other and they don't feel attached to that most important person. And as a result of that, they argue with one another and they set up these negative patterns. So as a therapist, my goal is to first create that safe space, that safe platform where they can talk about things and I can teach them and help them how to reconnect with one another so that they can have those conversations. And then having that conversation means that I'm helping them communicate, improve their communication pattern. Excuse me, my nose itches there. And lastly, what causes a lack of communication? And I thought about this, and I think that a couple things that really rise to the top. I think that my experience has taught me that people have different communication styles. One person might be passive aggressive, one person might be aggressive, uh, one person might be submissive. And because we have different communication styles and they're not really talked about, each person is pretty much doing their own thing, right? They're going into how they want to communicate. They're not really listening. They're not really acknowledging how the other person's communicating, and the other person's doing the exact same thing. And then basically these two types of communication styles clash. Like, oh, I'm this kind of person and she or he is this kind of person. And because of the differences, we have a tendency to um, uh, have like a lack of communication and we really can't communicate with one another very well. Um, like I said, one person might have poor listening skills. So, I mean, I think that in all relationships, um, one of the most important things is we want to be heard and listened to and seen and validated and understood. And when someone isn't listening to us and we feel like they're not listening to us, like they just don't get us, I think that really sets us up to a negative pattern because I'm going to hear people say, he or she just doesn't really get me. They're not really listening to me. They don't really understand where I'm coming from. And once again, just negative patterns that have been established over a period of time that people just kind of keep doing the same thing over and over again. I also think another what causes a lack of communication is that individuals or couples don't really sit down and talk about what the expectations are of the relationship, and therefore they will um, they will really not talk about the expectations. They'll kind of keep them in their mind. They'll try to mind read and try to figure those things out. And then what happens is people have these expectations of the other person or the relationship. And because they haven't fulfilled those expectations, they're going to start to fight. And then they're going to create this lack of communication between both of them. Um, and two other things that really contribute to a lack of communication, I would say, is empathy and curiosity. I want to expand for a second on those two things. Empathy and being empathic is being able to um, put yourself in the other person's shoes. And and understand where they're coming from. I'm not necessarily saying you have to completely understand, and I don't necessarily say you have to completely agree with them. But if you seek to understand and be empathic as to where they're coming from, it's like, I know my partner and I know he or she what they're saying, and I understand to some degree where they're coming from, and I can really put myself in their shoes. Then that's going to help you to become more empathic. And as a result of that, you might become a better listener, and you're going to have other ways of meeting your partner where they are. And then that person in return is going to feel like they're being heard. And I feel that, lastly, that curiosity and wonder is really important in a relationship. And what do I mean by that? I think that, in the beginning, when we first date somebody, right, we're very curious about that person and we wonder about that person a lot. And we ask a lot of questions. And I think sometimes people fall off when they're in relationships for a period of time, like they stop being curious about that person and they stop seeking to wonder about that person. But I think there's an invaluable lesson or a silver lining if you can stop and ask yourself, oh, I wonder why he or she is using that word. I wonder why he or she is behaving that way or has that thought, as a way to become curious. And you can become curious with your partner by just telling them to ask me more, or, what makes you feel that way, or why you're thinking that way, as a way to meet them halfway. So when we look at some of the signs of a poor communicator and what lends itself to poor communication, right? All those things I just discussed, especially the patterns that have been set up, which are very, very challenging at times to unravel and undo, then the conversation should really turn to, what are some things that we as a couple can start to do differently? If we have this awareness about these things of how my partner or myself are showing up, what are we willing to do collectively to change how we're relating to one another so that we can improve that communication? Like, what types of conversations are we willing that we really need to have or willing to have to create a different pattern? And often I will talk about, exploratory conversations. And exploratory conversations are, to me, it's not a conversation that's kind of like a one and done, but you're exploring how each person feels about something. So you pick a time that's really convenient for both of you. You pick a topic that you both want to discuss. You limit the conversation to the topic. You put a timestamp on it. You think about, if we really want to improve how we speak to one another, what are we both individually willing to do, so collectively for the couple? And then if you do that and you start talking about it, it's like, let's explore why we get upset about something. Let's explore why we feel disconnected. Let's explore why this issue keeps coming up. And if you go in with that mindset and you think about, how can I be a better partner? How can I listen to that person more effectively and in healthier ways that will become sustainable? Like, then how do you give each other the floor? 5 minutes for one person, 5 minutes for the other person, so that each person can share where they are coming from. And then also, what's important is to have a plan as to, when someone starts to get heated around something, or people start to feel like their emotions are escalating. And we all know when we feel that way. What's the plan beforehand? Are you going to check out? Are you going to say, I need a 5-minute timeout? Let me get up and go get a glass of water. Can we come back to this conversation in a few minutes, or can we postpone it for a period of time, but then have a plan to come back to that? Because oftentimes, another complaint in couples is that, okay, sure, I can honor that. I can say, let's come back to that. But then he or she never wants to circle back around and talk about it. And so it's like, all right, so then I'm the person who wants to pursue and I want to discuss these things. And the other person's gonna distance and they don't want to talk about those things. But then if I'm willing to say, okay, I can postpone that, then I need my partner to say, here's when we're going to come back and talk about that, because that's also another complaint in couples. Like, I can put that off, but then the person never comes back around. So by having a plan as to how you're going to talk about just one thing, not several, a specific period of time where both of you are emotionally available to talk about that, then that becomes a plan that people can start to implement. And those are some of the ways in which people can communicate differently and better. Those are some of the signs that show up for people, if they're a poor communicator. And like I said, maybe those things resonate with you. Maybe you've got a partner that it does. But there are ways in which to become a better communicator for yourself individually, and then the goal is collectively as a couple. And so I hope that, shed some light on, communication and relationships. If anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask me, I would, be happy to answer those. Um, and I'm open to any questions anybody might have. Okay. So, how can I improve my communication with my partner? First, I would want to know, thank you for asking that question. I would want to know what are some of the things that you're doing right now that you feel are not as healthy as they could be. For example, do you recognize your communication style? The other important component of that, what I work with people, is recognizing your attachment style. If you're anxious or you're avoidant, what is your attachment style? Because that also affects your communication style and how you're communicating with your partner. And so that would be something you really want to investigate. If you have an anxious attachment, then you might be coming from an anxious perspective, and that's how you're going to be communicating really anxious and not really and you're not really sure. So then I would first ask you, what are you doing that you don't feel is effective? What do you know if I would ask you a solution focused question, which would be, if you were a more effective communicator with your partner, what would that look like? And you want to start to think about and visualize, what would that look like? Would that be look like? Would you be using different language? Would you be managing your emotions? Would you be having a better time to talk to your partner? So I think that when we want to be doing something better, we often visualize that. What would that look like? And so then you want to say, okay, so these are some of the things I could do individually to better communicate with my partner, get my attachment style, communication style, check my emotions, have a good time, get a good time to talk, and then approach my partner as to, hey, this is on my mind. When will be a good time to talk about this? And I think that should be a really good start. And I hope that helps. Thanks for the question. Oh, I'm disabled and felt sicker. You cannot talk at all. It ends up in a huge fight. Okay. Um, all right. So thanks for the question. So you've been married for 40 years and now you're disabled and I think you felt sicker. I think that was that word. And now it ends up in a huge fight. And I think that um, it's a long time to be married. And I think that there's an upside to that. And I also want to know, I would want to know, you know, what are some of the fears, some of the concerns that are coming up when you try to talk to your husband, your spouse about your partner, to say around this situation? Because it says like, okay, it always ends up in a huge fight, and so that I wonder, how are you starting off that conversation? Are you starting off the conversation of, can we talk about this? Are you just kind of start talking about something ends up in a huge fight? I think that there's been a pattern probably of over all those years of that pattern. Are you willing to take a look at your pattern? How has your disability affected how you feel about yourself as a partner? You say, "Oh, I should have left years ago." Not really sure why you should have left years ago, but now you're here, and so are those same concerns coming up for you? And if it's ended up in a huge fight, I would always wonder, okay, so what is like the stimuli? What is the contributing factor that starts either of you to go down that slippery slope of coming up with a huge fight? If it is a huge fight, how are you talking to your partner around? How can we talk about this differently? Because often when it becomes a huge fight, that pattern is so ingrained that each person's coming from a place of fear or anxiety or disconnect, and then they fight over those things rather than talking about, these are some of my fears and concerns, and this is what's coming up for me. And I feel like this is what leads us into a fight. And so I would want to know, um, how you start those conversations off and why you feel like those conversations always go to a fight, right? Do you go back and do that same pattern of how you're talking about something? And how can you switch that up a little bit to say, I don't really want to fight about this. How can we talk about this one or two issues? And I hope that helps. Does over communication really ruin a relationship? I think that's a great question. Does over communication, well, like first, I would want to know how you would operationally define over communication. So if I hear that, sometimes I do feel that you can talk about the relationship too much and you can communicate. I guess it really depends on over. Does that mean you're calling during the day, you're texting during the day, you're always talking about something about the relationship. Sometimes it's important to say, let's do a check-in during the week a couple times, or let's set aside one or two times during the week where we can have a 20 or 30-minute conversation about the relationship. But I think why that's a really great question is because sometimes people talk about the relationship too much instead of just living the relationship. And like, why are you over communicating about it? Like, what do you have to keep talking about that in the relationship, right? Like, why do you have to keep communicating about the relationship? Is something not resolved? Do you not feel resolved about something? Does your partner always want to talk about it? And I would ask, coming from a place of curiosity or wonder, is to, why do we keep talking about why do we have to keep communicating about the relationship? So everybody defines over communicating differently, and it's really important to understand like how you define that. And then we'll talk about like the expectations of communication and how you would want to have a more balanced approach to the communication and how your partner feels about that. I think that people sometimes can talk things to death, and then after a while you're like, well, we keep talking about this. So either they're anxious about it or they want to keep talking about it because it's not resolved. There's something that they're not getting. And that's why they keep talking about it. Maybe there's some fears around the relationship. And if we don't keep talking about it. So I think that first you wanted to define what over communicating is in your relationship. And how do you talk about that with your partner if you feel like there's too much communication? And sometimes it's good to have some curiosity and some things you don't know. I mean, it's good not to be talking about every single thing all the time. And like I said, I always would go back to, why does that person have to be communicating that much? Is there something that they're not getting? Is there a need that's not being met? And I hope that helps. Do both people in the relationship have to communicate equally? If not, then is that relationship going to work equally? So, um, I wouldn't necessarily say they have to communicate equally, but they have to set up a good pattern of communication that's healthy for both people. So sometimes you're going to have one person that talks more than the other person, and that's not necessarily a problem unless it's a problem in the relationship. So if you're saying do they have to communicate equally, um, I don't necessarily I don't believe that people have to communicate equally for the relationship to work. Whatever is going to work for that particular relationship and those two people. If the person is communicating more because they have a deeper need to talk about things more, then you can still talk about that with your partner. But I don't I don't think that people doing something different is necessarily a bad thing unless it becomes an issue in the relationship. So you can have someone who goes out a lot and someone who doesn't, and that's not necessarily a bad thing unless it becomes a bad thing in the relationship. If it works, it works. If people are communicating differently, then that's not really a problem unless one person feels like I want to be more equal and let's have a conversation around that. And so if you're seeking an equality in communication, then you'd have to really I would ask you to define what that would look like. And are you okay with not being an equal? Because I would say that, lots of people communicate differently. I would say, and not equally. And that works. So I still go back to talk to your partner about what's coming up for you, why you feel this way, why you want it to be equal, if that's what you want it to be. And like, is this going to be a problem in the relationship or not? I hope that helps. Okay. Acting the way one. People should communicate openly. Okay, this is a long. Okay. Um, can you put that back up again? That question is really long. We should act and give the way we want to receive feelings are projected from one another. We can't expect attention if we ignore respect when we don't. If we are sure we give enough in a relationship, then we should receive the same. And if we don't, that means this person's not for us. It's easier when we meet someone to communicate clearly what our intentions are and expectations are. That's correct. Communicative issues arise mostly out of subconscious fear of abandonment. People should communicate openly and what's the rest of that sentence? You know, I think that to your point, I think that the openness and I hope I answered this right because it was a long it was a long statement, but thank you very much for sharing that. I think that in the beginning, we really want to figure out what we need in the relationship, and we should be able to articulate and share that with our partner of what we're looking for. And I don't sometimes doesn't necessarily have to be an equal as long as your needs are being met. If they're not being met, then there's your conversation. And I think that a lot of people maybe come from a fear of abandonment, maybe they come from a place of anxiety, but I think that couples want to be able to articulate what they need in the relationship and what they want to receive in the relationship. One of the things that comes up for me is, if we go to the place of love languages and, honoring and recognizing your partner's love language. So oftentimes we'll move into a relationship and we'll give the way that we want to receive when really that's not what that might not even resonate on that person. And so if we're able to articulate what our needs are, if we create that space where we talk about those things, like, this is really important to me, and this demonstrates that I feel like you really love me, or I'm receiving this love and attention this way, and that really resonates with me. Being able to articulate that to our partner, each person being able to do that. Um, I don't know if it all comes from a place of abandonment, but I think that we all come from a place of we want to be secure and in our feelings and our relationship, and we want to be secure as a person. And so, if we feel that way, if we're anxious, we feel we're going to be abandoned based on maybe our family of origin, our first family, or our past relationships or experiences, then we might come from that. We might come from a place of this person's going to leave. It still comes down to how can each person openly communicate in healthy ways to the other person what they want and what they need, and what's really going to land on them in a way that the person hears, and they're not defensive, but they're just articulating and sharing what they want from that person, what that expectation is. And I think you bring up a very good point. And I think that a lot of people are apprehensive to do that, or don't know how to do that. But if people have a foundation or some building blocks on how to talk to one another, and how to articulate what they're thinking and how they're feeling, then I think that bodes well and goes a long way to having those more deeper, more meaningful conversations, so that each person gets what they want and what they need in that relationship, you know, throughout the course of the relationship. And even if those needs and wants change over a period of time. And thanks for that. That's a good question, good statement. Thanks. Okay. Right. So, all right. So, so this is a common problem, and um, I think that one of the things I work on with people is to turn a complaint into a request. So, so there's two parts to this. One, it's common that someone will say something and they'll want something, and then and the partner will feel like you're nagging them. And I find that, or someone's nagging them, and I find that the reason why people do that is because one person's asking something, maybe the person says they're going to do that, or maybe they don't follow through, and then the other person feels like they're not being heard, and then they keep going after and asking the person the same thing, and the person says, you're nagging me. And I think that this is a very common dynamic between people. So there's two things. Like, one, you're going to ask something of your partner, and they're going to say, yeah, I'm going to do that, and then they don't follow through, and then you have to keep going back and returning, and then they say, like, you're nagging me. The other thing is, you express a need or a want from your partner, and they don't do that, and then they say that you're nagging them. Whereas I think there's another conversation there, and the other conversation would be, how can I turn a complaint into a request? How can I come from, and asking, listen, I don't want to complain about this, but this is what's coming up for me, and I really need you to follow through. Would be really important for me if you could start to do this. It would be important if maybe we can get to a place here. Because I don't want to be the person that's nagging you. You're using that word, which is, a negative and derogatory word, but people use it. But then I would wonder for the other person, like, why isn't this person following through? Like, why is it, partner? Why is it hard for him or her to listen to what you need and to follow through on something? Because they're not doing something on their end that they need to do, correct? So then it's going to put you in a position where I have to keep going back and I have to keep asking him or her to do this and to follow through. When the conversation is, it's like, I don't really want to be that person. I don't want to be the person that nags. I don't want to have to be the one that's doing the heavy lifting. I don't want to be the one that has to carry it and keep going back and asking about this. What are we going to be doing differently? What can each of us do differently? How can I put in a request of, this is like really important to me and I need to understand why this is not, why there's no follow through on that. And then where is that conversation? Right. And then is your partner able to hear that and to respond, not become defensive? It's like maybe they feel overwhelmed, maybe they don't know what to do, maybe they're tired. I don't know. Could be lots of things. But what happens is if you're not, it's like if a person has to keep going back, right, and pursuing, then the other person might distance or say, you're nagging. And it's like, well, why am I the one, right? The 100%, like the 100% comes from each person, not the 50, it's the 100% each person. So why am I always one having to go back and ask something of you when we've already had that discussion? And then you, as a person who's put up that question, feels like a bad person, right? Feels like I don't want to be this nag. I don't want to be this person, but why won't he or she listen to me? Um, and meet me halfway? And where's that conversation of why we keep ending up in the same place? I hope that helps. Mm, okay. Right. Right. And so you're not generally a talkative person, and so your partner feels like there's something wrong and so forth. And you've gone back and you've explained this, and so I would want to know. Then you say, what can I do to correct this? First, I would want to know, um, you're not a talkative person in what respect? Number one. Number two, what have you gone back to explain to her? Have you shared with her, why you're not a talkative person, or what makes it hard for you to talk, or maybe that's just your personality, and that's your style. And so if that's your personality and that's your style, then I would want to know, why does that continue to create tension with her, even though you've explained that to her? Because then what happens is, then you have to keep going back and explaining, right? I'm not this talkative person. That would be something I would discuss first. The other thing I would want to know is, if you're asking how can I correct this, it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, do you not I don't know. I would say, do you want to become a more talkative person? Are there times that you're more talkative than others? Do you do better if you have like a check-in a couple times a week and then you can talk? So I'm not really sure what the expectations are around want to be a more talkative person. If she's assuming that there's something wrong and it creates tension, and you go back to her and you explain to her, I'm just not a talkative person, then I would still want to know, why does that cause tension with her and in the relationship? I mean, why does she continue to feel like something is wrong or something is remiss if you're not talking? If you say, "Hey, this is who I am, this is my personality," then I would want to know, would you be willing to say, if we can do a couple of times a week, or maybe you're already doing that, and this is like the best I can do. I can lean into that conversation and I could be a little more talkative, but I'm probably not going to be as talkative as you if that's who you are. If you're not talkative for other reasons, then I would want to know what those other reasons are. Are you anxious? You're not really sure what to say? Maybe it turns into an argument. And so, to me, when someone's not talkative, it's like, is it a behavior thing? Is it a personality thing? Is it you're not really sure what to say thing? That to me is part of that bigger conversation that I would want to know from you, as to, you know, why you're not talkative. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's only going to be a bad thing if it's problematic in the relationship and you're saying, well, it causes tension. And I'm thinking, well, okay, but if you've already explained that, then why does it still cause tension? And I would want to ask her that. Why does it still cause, like I said, why does it still cause tension for her, even though you've explained that to her? Is there something that she's not getting? Why does she feel like something is wrong if you're not talking? Which maybe goes to her upbringing, her attachment style, her other relationship experiences. It's why she's feeling that way when you're not talking. Thank you. Okay, if that's all for questions, I really appreciate everybody's come on, and I hope I've answered your questions and given you some things to think about. I do have a free ebook. It's on 23 communication tips. It's on my website, which is reflectionsfromacrossthecouch.com. And you can just go down to the homepage, scroll down, and put your email in, and I'll shoot you out that. And you can also I do a lot of reels on Instagram. My handle is Dr. K Davin on Instagram, and I do communication tips every week for like communication tip, and I also do a lot of communication videos on my YouTube channel. So there's lots of things, there's lots of areas that you can check me out and get some other information. I'd be happy to help. You can also email me at hello@drkristin.com if for some reason I didn't answer your question or you didn't have time and you have another question. Certainly, more than happy to help in any way I can. And I hope that um, this platform has helped people that are listening today and answer any kind of questions or get more insight as to how you can become a better communicator in your relationship or maybe extend it over to your partner. And again, thanks to the Minds Journal for this collaboration, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks.